It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Former Vermont Governor Jim Douglas is mad these days at the leaders of his alma mater, Middlebury College. He's so appalled he skipped his 50th class reunion and is leading a lawsuit after the college removed the Mead Memorial Chapel sign from the iconic structure 2 years ago. The sign was taken down because former Governor John Mead supported eugenics in the early 20th century. Douglas, class of 72, says college officials are using Mead as a scapegoat in an era of cancel culture where the words and actions of many public figures have been reviewed and their names sometimes scrubbed from buildings or programs. Douglas argues Middlebury officials have distorted and disparaged Mead's legacy and broken an agreement they made when Mead donated $75,000 to build the prominent marble structure back in 1914. College lawyers say Mead was a vocal advocate of the eugenics movement, which they argue inspired the Nazis' later program of forced sterilization, as well as eugenics efforts here in Vermont that resulted in the sterilization of 250 people. The Vermont legislature has apologized for the state's role in supporting eugenics. In terms of the key question raised in the lawsuit, Middlebury's lawyers argue Mead's gift did not amount to a legally binding agreement to keep the Mead name on the chapel forever. Douglas and the Mead family disagree. The lawsuit is ambling along in a Vermont Superior Court, but a recent decision rejecting the college's efforts to dismiss the case included language that might give a hint as to the ultimate outcome. In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company, I caught up with Douglas at his office at Middlebury College, where he serves as a scholar in residence and has taught several courses. College officials refused my request for an in-person interview. Why did you agree to take on this effort that the family asked you to get the name back on?
Well, first of all, it wasn't John Mead's name. I often have fun with my students and ask, why do you think Governor Mead chose the name Mead Memorial Chapel while he was still alive? And the answer is, it wasn't named for himself. It was named for the generations of Meads who were the first settlers in the Otter Valley, and he wanted to honor his ancestors. So the college removed a name, putting out a press release saying that it was named for Governor Mead. So they took the name off a building without knowing for whom it was named. The ancestors were people who brought Christianity to western Vermont. They befriended the native settlers here, and it was a legacy that Governor Mead wanted to honor. His descendants reached out to me right after the fateful day in late September 2021 and expressed their outrage at what had happened. I didn't know them at the time, but I recognized the surname and was happy to chat with them about the desecration of the chapel that their ancestor gave to the college. To make a long story short, with an attorney, I went to the probate court in Rutland and was appointed administrator of the estate. So it's in that capacity that I have the authority to bring the action against the college to seek restoration of the Mead family name.
Why did you agree to do this?
I was as outraged as the descendants. This is presentism. It's political correctness gone berserk. Governor Mead gave a speech in 1912, his farewell address as governor, and in a couple of paragraphs he talked about some ideas that are broadly in the category of eugenics. He proposed two things. One, that marriage licenses not be issued to people of limited intellectual capacity, and secondly, that a commission be appointed to study a new procedure known as vasectomy, a more humane way of sterilization. Nothing came of those ideas. The legislature passed some of that during the next session, but it was vetoed by his successor, and nothing ever happened until the 1930s after Governor Mead was dead and gone. Meanwhile, Middlebury College, from at least 1895 until 1945, a half century, had eugenics on its curriculum. In fact, in 1908, you couldn't graduate from Middlebury without taking a course on degenerates and defectives. It was a mandatory class for graduating seniors. By 1925, they decided to indoctrinate the freshmen, and so similar courses were required there. As a freshman at Middlebury in 1925, you had to learn about, quote, improvements of the race, low intelligence of the masses, the problems of having vast numbers of illiterate or subnormal citizens. A professor on our faculty did a report a couple of years ago, and he said it's not unfair to suggest that generations of eugenicists were trained at Middlebury College. So in 1912, as a trustee, someone affiliated with an institution where this was embedded in its curriculum, why would anybody be surprised that Governor Mead would offer these ideas? So when he made the donation to the college in 1914, it was gratefully accepted by the president and trustees, and included in his letter of gift was the name, in quotes, Mead Memorial Chapel. You know, I don't know what they're going to say about us 100 years from now, but here's a guy who was progressive by the standards of his day. He was for women's suffrage. He was for tougher child labor laws. He was for more campaign finance disclosure. He was for clean energy. He wanted to replace coal with hydroelectric power. He started Vermont Technical College and the Austin School for the Deaf down in Brattleboro. In 1912, at the Republican National Convention, he was touted for vice president because the President Taft and the party knew that it was going to be a tough race against Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, who was coming back after 4 years out of office and drawing a lot of votes. So they thought, well, let's get somebody more progressive on the ticket. How about Governor Mead up in Vermont? And there were handbills that were circulated at the National Convention that year. He wasn't interested. But he was very highly thought of.
Okay, you mentioned the speech that he gave in 1912. Let me just read one paragraph of what he said. He said, "The heads of our criminal institutions tell us that among the inmates there's a considerable class that are termed, quote, degenerates or, quote, unquote, defectives, by which is meant a class of individuals in whose mental and nervous construction there is something lacking. Alienists, criminologists, and physicians tell us that individuals of this unfortunate class tend to marry those cursed with similar defects, and that this class is increasingly out of proportion to the normal growth of our population, and that most of the insane, the epileptics, the imbeciles, the idiots, the sexual perverts, together with many of the confirmed inebriates, prostitutes, tramps, and criminals that fill our penitentiaries, jails, asylums, and poor farms, are the result of these intermarriages or natural offspring of defective parents. In the cases of these unfortunates, there's little or no hope of permanent recovery, and the great question that is now being considered by lawmakers in many of our states is how best to restrain this defective class and how best to restrict the propagation of defective children." When you hear that, what's your reaction?
Well, it doesn't sound very good a century later, without any question, but it was very mainstream at the time. A lot of prominent people in public office, in literature, in science, in the arts, were eugenicists, arguably. And Governor Mead was a man of his time. It's interesting that he went on to suggest, I'm not sure if it was in that speech or not, that there are basically two ways to address this: isolation, lock them up, or sterilize them. And he said, I think it would be more humane to opt for the latter, because then they can live among us and enjoy whatever level of enjoyment they can in their lives. So his attitude at the time was humane in relative terms. But Middlebury College put out a press release literally comparing him to Hitler. And that's what's so offensive. It's just a ridiculous suggestion, especially given the fact that Middlebury College was a eugenics factory for a half century.
Okay, but isn't there a difference between teaching about that, where you have academic freedom to discuss ideas, as opposed to somebody, you're a former governor, somebody in a position of power like being governor, expressing these views, advocating that the legislature take action?
Well, they're both aspects of free expression. Academic freedom is clearly important, and Middlebury had plenty of that in those days. They hosted a conference in 1913 on eugenics. They had several professors who served on national eugenics committees who gave speeches promoting this around the state. President Moody of Middlebury College made some very disparaging comments about French Canadians sometime after Governor Mead's speech. Middlebury College was not just extending academic freedom to its faculty, but in fact promoting this with the mandatory courses that were required in order to graduate. Nothing happened from Governor Mead's proposal. Perhaps I can identify with that. Legislatures don't always take cues from chief executives.
But is that relevant?
Oh, I think so.
Why?
Because he was expressing an opinion, and that's the problem with Middlebury College.
He was urging them to take action. That's than an opinion.
Well, I don't know. He made recommendations on a lot of things in his farewell address, and this was one of them. But he was expressing an opinion, and that's what really annoys his descendants, that he's being punished not for anything he did, but for something he said. And free expression has been a problem for Middlebury, as you may be aware. 6 years ago, we had an episode with Charles Murray here. 4 years ago, we had an episode with Rizard Legutko, whose speech was canceled by the administration. You can't just have a policy that says we welcome different points of view. You have to actually make it happen.
There's an expression I've heard before, is this a hill you die on? You could have easily not gotten involved in this. Why is this so important for you to take this step, putting yourself out in the public, potentially being criticized, etc.?
Well, I don't mind the criticism. I've been quite accustomed to it for many, many decades by other folks in the public arena, by the media, by
you understand
people.
My question.
I do. I feel strongly about this. A couple of years ago, I co-chaired a task force on campus free expression at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington. It was a great experience with a former Democratic colleague and a lot of college leaders from around the country. And we talked about the different aspects of free expression, allowing different ideas to be voiced on campus, academic freedom, the problem of self-censorship by students and faculty, and how important it is that at this point in their lives, students be exposed to a variety of different ideas, and then they can make up their own mind about what they believe. Well, by erasing a family name from a prominent building, arguably the most prominent building on Middlebury's campus, the college chose to erase history. And Anthony Kronman, who's a former dean of law at Yale, wrote a book about this and some other topics a couple years ago, and he said rather than erase history, we need to contextualize it. And I agree with that. Now, this is an academic institution. We should be learning about our history, not wiping it out. So I think it's very important that students know what Governor Mead said, but also respect his love of this college and his tremendous philanthropy, because he was very, very generous to it.
Now, Princeton University has taken Woodrow Wilson's name off of a prominent building because of his views, his quote-unquote racist thinking and policy. The Sackler name has been removed from some 20 buildings now. Is that in the same category as this?
Well, it's, I suppose, a case where every situation has some nuance and is different, so I don't want to say that one decision somewhere else is right or wrong. But
why not? I mean, if it's about intellectual freedom, why not say how you feel about it?
Well, I don't know all the facts, whereas in the case of Governor Mead, I think I do.
Well,
but,
you know about the Sacklers. You're a student of history. You know about Woodrow Wilson.
Well, they took the name of Wilson off a couple of institutions at Princeton in 2020. 4 years earlier, they went through a process of deciding whether to retain his name, and they decided to keep it. It was the George Floyd murder that led them to make that decision 4 years later. But when they decided to keep it, I've read the entire report, and it's quite lengthy. They engaged academics from around the country to advise them on that decision. And here's what Professor David Kennedy at Stanford University said at that time. Quote, "In a world where there is no shortage of evil, it surely seems perverse to highlight the imperfections rather than the positive accomplishments of those who tried to do their best. In a world of none but fallen people, the good that some of them managed to do deserves all the recognition that it can get." So at that time, they decided to keep Wilson's name, and I think that's the point that I'm trying to make about Governor Mead. Everybody has warts, even you and I. Who knows what they'll say about us many years from now. But I hope, as Dean Kronman said, we'll look at the overall dominant legacy of an individual. And I think if we do that in the case of Governor Mead, we'll conclude that it was very positive indeed.
I've heard you in other forums talk about this idea of not judging somebody based on their worst day. But how far are you willing to take that? I mean, you already have raised the name of Hitler. I was not going to, but you did.
The college did.
Okay. But you have too in this discussion that we've had. I mean, how far do you take that idea of somebody's worst quality and trying to offset that by, who knows about figures in history that have clearly done. I mean, maybe the Sackler family were nice took in humane, dogs. Maybe they supported the Humane Society.
Well, the issue, I believe, is what Dean Kronman indicated in his book, which is let's look at the dominant legacy. I think everyone would argue that Hitler's dominant legacy was quite perverse and negative. With Governor Mead, I would argue strongly it was not. It was a few paragraphs in one speech. I've seen no other public utterances on his part about this compared to a lifetime of service. I mean, he was a generous employer based on everything I've learned. He had a farm in West Rutland. He had manufacturing companies in Rutland and New York City. He was very generous to his community. He was a public servant, the first mayor of Rutland after the city was incorporated in the 1890s, a legislator, lieutenant governor, and then governor for a term. He gave generously to his church in Rutland. He founded the recreation center in the city, as well as giving a lot of money to his alma mater that he loved. And for the college to compare him to Hitler and then to make allusions to racism is not only unfair, it's just wrong. This is a guy who interrupted his studies at Middlebury to join the Union Army.
Yeah, he was in the Civil War. I'm aware. I'm aware of his history too. Are there any situations that you see? You've talked about this idea of cancel culture, where it is appropriate to remove a name from a building at an institution.
I don't want to hypothesize, Mark. If there were Hitler Hall somewhere, I might argue that should come down. But every situation is different. I'm focused on Mead Memorial Chapel. By the way, we have a website, meadmemorialchapel.com. And I just think what the college did was simply wrong.
Was the agreement that this would be named in perpetuity?
Well, we believe that it was because it was silent. The building, I often point out, was constructed of marble at his direction. That lasts quite a long time. A Mead family Bible is in the cornerstone of the chapel. So he obviously had his DNA in there and expected it to last for as long as marble structures do. I think that absent some limitation on the duration of a gift, it is deemed perpetual.
Okay, but this is you teach here. You graduated from here. This is a private institution. Why can't they just do whatever they darn well please?
Well, a deal's a deal. And when he made the gift in 1914, he was very specific about the name. The president and trustees accepted it on that basis. There are letters from trustees. There are the minutes of the trustees meeting where the name was included and mentioned as they accepted the gift. They had a deal, and they need to honor it.
Despite the heated back and forth arguments about Mead's role in the Vermont eugenics program, Vermont Law School professor Jerry Carter told WCAX's Christina Gesford that the lawsuit Douglas is leading is essentially a case concerning contract law.
Ultimately, a judge is going to have to decide whether or not the contract that existed between Mead and Middlebury is valid today. If it is and enforceable, then yes, the governor's lawsuit carries water. If a court finds that it's not enforceable, then the case is likely not to go anywhere. But that's really what's at the heart of this. It's a contracts case. The reality is what a court's going to be looking at is not whether or not Middlebury has sullied former Governor Mead's name. This isn't a defamation case. This is a contracts case, and the court's going to have to look at the contract, the four corners of the contract, and say, is it enforceable against Middlebury today, all of these years later?
What could Middlebury's defense be in this case?
Middlebury is likely to argue that there was no binding contract at the time that could be enforced, particularly with respect to the naming of the chapel. Clearly, there was an agreement over the funding and the building of a chapel. I think what this is going to boil down to, and where the court's really going to have to look carefully at the language of the agreement, is whether or not there was an agreement to have it named the Mead Chapel in perpetuity, in other words, forever. And that's a little bit less clear.
More in a moment. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. Back to our discussion with former Governor Jim Douglas, who's leading a lawsuit against Middlebury College. Let's go back here and talk a little bit more about this idea of looking through somebody through the prism of today, of what they said in the past. Are there times where it's appropriate, we change, we evolve, hopefully we get better in our thinking? Are there situations where it's appropriate that you look back at what somebody believed in the past and take corrective action for now? Particularly, I think about, like the situation with Woodrow Wilson. There are, African-American students at that college who are greatly offended by his actions, who felt that walking into that building was just a slap in the face. How do you feel about this issue of looking at somebody's comments, views of the past in the current situation?
Well, I think there are different circumstances. I don't know all the details about Princeton and Wilson, but my assumption is that those were honors bestowed on him. He didn't personally give the money for the buildings or programs that bore his name, and that's what's different about Governor Mead. He paid for the chapel. He didn't just give the college some money. He was on the committee that dealt with the architect and the contractor. He personally oversaw its construction. He personally handed the keys of the chapel to the president of the college when it was dedicated in 1916. So they had a deal, and they have to honor that. A way to look at the past and reflect on it has been suggested by a number of faculty colleagues here, and that is to put up some explanatory plaque or information about Governor Mead's life and legacy, including the offending paragraphs in his 1912 speech. And I think that would satisfy his descendants as well as a lot of people around Middlebury.
Are you offended by those comments that I read that he said?
Well, of course, by 21st century standards, they are offensive, but not by early 20th century standards, and that's, I think, what we're talking about here. It's presentism.
But we're living in the 21st century here.
Well, you can go back and find quotes by anybody that offend us. Are we going to tear down the Washington Monument and change the name of the District of Columbia? I mean, I guess there are people who want to do that, but times change, and we have to understand that life was different back then, and learn from that history, not erase it.
So you really see this, you really boil this down to a contract issue.
Well, it's contract, it's equity, it's fairness, it's respecting the terms of a gift. I don't want to get into legalisms, Mark, because we're making a number of legal claims.
And you're not a lawyer.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, but at the same time, you say that if it was silent at the time, the assumption should be that it's in perpetuity. Why can't the college make the exact argument the other way, that unless it's specified that it was in writing that this would be in perpetuity, that they can do whatever they want?
Well, I'm told, and I can't confirm this, that in recent years the college has instituted a new policy of putting a limit on the right to a name on a building. Since that was not in effect 100 years ago, I think the assumption is that it was perpetual. And I've talked with a couple of development professionals, one retired, one still active in consulting recently, who said the understanding in the development world is that as long as the building stands, the name should be honored.
this is an issue that's not going to surprise you that I'm going to raise. You've heard it before from other people. Is there any, you were governor for during the period of time when gay marriage came up, and you, in fact, vetoed the legislation that would have allowed that. Is this a proxy fight for you that you don't want to be viewed, when we look back at history, as somebody who wasn't in step with the times?
I hadn't thought of that.
Really? Come
yes,
on.
Yes, I have not thought of that.
Okay.
And I believe I was in step with the times. Bill and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama had the same view on gay marriage as I did in 2009.
Okay, but they have changed their views.
They did.
Okay.
They did.
Have you?
I accept the ruling of the United States Supreme Court, and I don't think it's ever going to come up again. We've moved on.
That's a cop-out answer. Come on. What do you think about gay marriage today?
I think that we've moved on.
Really? I mean, have you changed? So you haven't changed your view on that?
I think we've all moved on.
Okay. Huh. Because at the time, and even in your book, which is sitting here on your bookcase, you talk about that you wanted to defend traditional marriage. And that was really all you said about it. Why not say more about it either then or in your book?
I don't have anything to add at this point, Mark. The Supreme Court of the United States has said that this is a constitutional right, and I respect that process, and that's where we are. It was a controversial topic, but I respect everybody's point of view. Who knows what people will say 100 years from now about me or about you? I mean, everybody has a record of public comments and writings, and we all might have said or done or written something that a century from now won't read very well.
What's been the reaction here on campus? For example, I know you interact with students. What's been the reaction of the student body in your sense?
Not a lot, and what I've observed is varied. These are young people who are here to get an education, and I hope this will be part of it. I've been very encouraged by the response of the faculty, frankly. A number of them have said, I don't know whether I'm in favor or opposed to the decision the college made, but there was no transparency. It was done almost in the middle of the night, and they believe that as an educational institution, we had an obligation in advance to discuss this issue and make a thoughtful decision. I think about the college's experience some time ago when it decided ultimately to divest its portfolio of fossil fuel securities. That went on for about 10 years. I remember moderating a panel discussion over in an auditorium, and it was entirely transparent. And so a lot of people believe that the college really blew it in that respect.
What's been the reaction here? I mean, you're on the faculty. You've got an office here. Has there been any sort of pressure put on you, any discomfort, any criticism of that? Is there anybody that wants your head too?
I saw one of your colleagues who suggested that, but other than that, no, not at Middlebury. The college is committed to free expression, and here's an opportunity to prove it.
So nobody has said to you what you did was inappropriate? I've
been pleasantly surprised by the reaction on campus. A lot of faculty don't want to put their name on a public statement, but they've encouraged me in many cases.
It seems to me, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, that the only way that this is going to happen, that the name gets put back on, is through a court order. You said that, I've seen in other forums, that you went and actually talked to some of the powers that be here. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what was the reaction you got from them when you did that?
A brick wall. I had 2 meetings with college officials. I had a telephone call with another. I had a brief email exchange with the president, and nobody seemed moved at all. And that's why I agreed to work with the descendants on pursuing a different course.
When you say they weren't moved at all, so were they willing to have a discussion with you about it?
In fact, at one meeting, the college official in whose office we were meeting got up and stormed out of his own office. No, they weren't interested in a discussion.
You mentioned the idea of using the chapel or keeping the Mead name in a sense to further educate people. Mm-hmm. So, what would be an appropriate way to do that?
Well, perhaps there'll be courses about this. There was an article in the Vermont Historical Society Journal. It's being turned into a book on eugenics in Vermont. Perhaps we could learn about Governor Mead and other individuals for whom buildings are named on this campus. I would think there's a great educational opportunity there. You know, an irony of this whole thing is that probably before September 27th of 2021, 98% of people who walked by Mead Memorial Chapel had no clue who Governor Mead was or that he was even a governor. Now, 98% think he was a eugenicist, and that's the problem. He was a good and decent man. He was a loyal and generous alumnus. He had some ideas that today we view as unacceptable, but overall his legacy was very positive for the state of Vermont.
But he was also a eugenicist in addition to all the other things that you've mentioned, right?
He offered some ideas that we wouldn't find acceptable today.
Okay, doesn't that make him a eugenicist?
Arguably.
The Vermont legislature a couple of years back issued an apology for any promotion that the state of Vermont did on this whole idea of eugenics. Mm-hmm. What'd you think about that?
I thought it was fine. There was a lot of eugenics activity in the 30s after a sterilization bill passed, and it was centered at the University of Vermont principally. There was a state commission that had a subcommittee that was dealing with that as well. I talked with the senator who presented that resolution to his colleagues, and he assures me that Governor Mead never came up in their deliberations. I got hold of the testimony from the state archivist before the Senate Government Operations Committee, and in 10 pages of testimony by the state archivist on the history of eugenics in Vermont, she never mentioned Governor Mead. That's why this is so wrong. It's way out of proportion. The argument that this new book is going to make that Governor Mead had a campaign, that he spearheaded all of this, is just ridiculous. Most of the activity occurred well after his death.
Okay, but he was one of the early people talking about this. I mean, you've looked into the history, too. There was not a lot of discussion about this. I mean, he's credited that speech that he gave in 1912 as really being, the first by the prominent person to really try to advance this idea.
And then what happened? It passed the next year. It was vetoed by his successor. It came up in the 1915 session. It came out of committee, but died on the floor of the House. In 1917, a bill was introduced that never went anywhere. Nothing happened until 1931, after he was gone.
Okay, but if you had advanced an idea in the 4 terms you were in, and it had been rejected by your successor, would that take away from what your viewpoint was at the time?
It wouldn't take away from what my viewpoint was, but it would certainly take away from what the effect was, and that's the crux of this, Mark. He's being punished for his ideas, not for his actions.
How concerned are you about this whole idea of cancel culture?
I'm very concerned about it. That's why I co-chaired the Commission on Free Expression at the Bipartisan Policy Center. There's a lot of it going on in different ways. Shouting down or disinviting speakers is an obvious one. Academic freedom, interference with academic freedom is another. Self-censorship by students or faculty is yet another. And, of course, the whole monument building denaming issue is yet another. And that wasn't as prominent when we came out with our report several years ago. That was just beginning. But I'm concerned about it because I believe, especially at an academic institution, more information, more education, more speech, more transparency is better than less. We're supposed to be educating kids to learn how to sift through a lot of stuff that they hear and make their own decisions and decide what they believe. And we just can't deny people that right to be heard. The same is true of Governor Mead posthumously as it is for somebody more contemporaneous.
Here's more from WCAX's Christina Gesford's interview with Vermont Law School professor Jerry Carter.
Now, Middlebury's decision to remove the Mead name came during a time in the country when many institutions were reevaluating and examining the history of their statues and plaques named after or in honor of public figures with debatable backgrounds. Is this a symptom of cancel culture, and should a public figure be held accountable for something they said or did more than a century ago?
Is it cancel culture? I don't know that I'd go that far. Look, obviously, there's no way to hold an individual who lived hundreds of years ago accountable. They're dead, they're gone. But certainly today's institutions who are still existing, and Middlebury clearly is, thriving in many respects, can look at how do we want to represent ourselves to the world. And I think that's really what this is about. And so is it holding, former Governor Mead accountable? No. But it's certainly looking at what are the accountabilities with respect to today's institutions, to people today, right? There's no claim in this case about cancel culture or wokeness. That's the outside narrative.
In 2018, the University of Vermont Board of Trustees voted to remove the name of Guy W. Bailey, UVM's 13th president, from the main university library for his support of the eugenics movement, leaving only the Howe name behind. Bailey, on the other hand, did not provide funds for the library, a key distinction from the Middlebury case. If this case doesn't get decided the way you and the Mead family want it to be decided, is this an institution that you can continue at?
It's interesting that a columnist for the Boston Globe said that actually the more offensive name is Middlebury rather than Mead because of its long history of teaching eugenics here. On a personal level, I'll have to make that decision when the time comes, but it probably isn't going to be right away.
All right, but if you had to make that decision today, what would you weigh
That's sort of presentism too, isn't it? I don't have to make that decision today. We'll see what happens.
In his recent refusal to dismiss the case outright, as Middlebury College lawyers had requested, Judge Robert Mello did include language that might indicate Douglas and the Mead family face a challenge ahead. Mello said, quote, "Whether framed under contract or gift law, proof that a perpetual naming right was intended ultimately will have to satisfy an elevated standard of clarity," unquote. But in court cases, baseball, or elections, it ain't over until it's over. In 2002, a poll showed Republican Jim Douglas 10 points behind his Democratic opponent, Doug Racine, 2 days before the election, an election that Douglas won by 3 percentage points. So stay tuned. That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored in part by Red Hen Cafe and Bakery. Thanks for listening.